Hello, my dear friends. They wore corsets so tight their ribs could crack, swallowed arsenic for glowing skin, and smiled through laudanum haze while slowly fading away. These weren't horror stories. These were beauty standards. Women weren't living. They were displayed, sedated, and slowly erased. The more lifeless they looked, the more refined they were, and somehow society applauded. Tonight, let's walk through velvet parlours and shadowed sick rooms to discover why Victorian women were called the walking dead. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one looked at the faces of fashionable Victorian women, the first impression would often be that of lifelessness. The pallor of their cheeks, the stark whiteness that seemed to glow in dim light, gave them an appearance closer to statues than to living beings. It was not a natural shade of pale born from staying indoors or from frailty alone, but rather the result of a powder deliberately pressed upon their skin. This powder, made of white lead, was the cosmetic of choice in a society obsessed with purity, refinement, and the appearance of delicate fragility. To many, the whiter the skin, the higher the status. It separated the wealthy from the poor who toiled under the sun, and it created a new form of beauty that looked less like life and more like death preserved. The women who wore this powder every day believed they were following the demands of elegance. The white dust clung to their pores, creating a smooth layer that concealed any blemishes, freckles, or redness. Yet, beneath that surface, the skin struggled to breathe. Day after day, pores clogged and infections spread, turning natural faces into canvases of pain hidden behind a mask. As hours passed, the powder cracked along lines of expression. Smiles left tiny fissures. Frowns split the surface, and over time, the faces looked more like dried plaster than flesh. It is almost darkly amusing that something sold as a sign of vitality made women resemble corpses instead. The process of applying the powder was not casual. Women sat for long periods, carefully brushing or pressing the fine grains onto their cheeks and forehead. Mirrors reflected not only their image but also the ambition of appearing untouchable and aristocratic. The more evenly coated the face, the stronger the illusion of perfection. In parlours across London, Paris, and countless towns, young women practiced the same ritual, guided by their mothers or ladies' maids. Boxes of white powder sat proudly on dressing tables, next to combs and perfumes. Reminders that beauty came not from health, but from the manipulation of appearance. What made this practice so chilling was the very substance itself. Lead, a heavy metal, slowly seeped into the skin. Each stroke of powder delivered more poison to the bloodstream. The effects did not arrive immediately, which made the danger even easier to dismiss. Instead, over months and years, the body weakened. Headaches, fatigue, and stomach pains became common companions. Hair fell out in clumps, and gums bled without cause. At first, these were explained away as the burdens of womanhood or the result of weak constitutions. Rarely did anyone connect the elegance of pale beauty with the suffering that followed. Doctors of the time occasionally raised warnings, yet their voices carried little weight against the overwhelming force of fashion. Magazines praised the ghostly glow of noble ladies, painters immortalized them on canvas, and novels described heroines with alabaster skin. The culture itself demanded the look, and so the risks were buried under the weight of expectation. In today's terms, it would be like applauding someone for drinking bleach daily because it made their teeth look whiter. The absurdity is obvious now, but in the crowded drawing rooms of the 19th century, it was accepted without question. The cost of this beauty was not only measured in illness but sometimes in death. Women collapsed in their homes, wasting away without a clear explanation. The quiet tragedy of their passing often went unremarked, attributed to vague ailments or inherited weakness. Families mourned, but society rarely changed. Cosmetics companies continued to produce powders in large quantities, and vendors promoted them as essential. The deadly truth was masked by delicate packaging and by the endless praise for a skin tone that looked less like a flush of life and more like the pallor of a corpse. When I imagine this, I cannot help but feel unsettled by how willingly people chose poison in the name of elegance. The sight of these women walking along city streets or sitting rigidly in parlours left an eerie impression. Their faces, smooth and unnaturally pale, caught the light in ways that emphasized their distance from the warmth of the living. Combined with dark gowns or high collars, the effect could be haunting. Even in moments of laughter, the cracks in the powder revealed something unnatural. To the poor who saw them, these women looked less like figures of admiration and more like unreachable beings, untouchable by the dirt and struggle of the ordinary life. Yet beneath that surface, they suffered silently, carrying both the weight of expectation and the slow poison coursing through their bodies. This contradiction became one of the defining features of Victorian beauty culture. The ideal was deathly, and yet it was celebrated. To be pale, fragile, and distant was to be desired. To be rosy, strong, and natural was to risk being called vulgar or common. The powders did more than change appearances. They reshaped values, turning health into something less fashionable than decline. The vanity tables, with their small pots of powder and their brushes, tell a quiet story of desperation. They reflect a society willing to trade life for image, to embrace sickness as status, and to watch women fade away while calling them beautiful. No portrait or painted canvas fully reveals the cost, but the graves left behind tell another story, one written in silence. Their powdered faces turn them into living masks, pale and fragile. The obsession with this lifeless appearance would only grow deeper. What if the true mark of beauty was not health, but the very look of slow decay? The standards of beauty in Victorian society did not celebrate strength, vigour, or the glow of health. Instead, the admired appearance was one of weakness, as if life itself had nearly departed. Hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, and lips tinged with purple were all signs of what was called consumptive beauty. This phrase came from the image of tuberculosis patients, whose bodies wasted away but who carried a fragile, ghostly elegance that captured the imagination of the era. Women were expected to embody this look deliberately, even when they were not ill. To appear sickly was to appear refined, and to appear robust was to risk being judged as common or vulgar. Paintings and novels reinforced this strange preference. Heroine figures were rarely described as healthy, lively, or full of energy. Instead, they were drawn as pale, distant, and frail, with a kind of delicate suffering written into their faces. Society equated illness with sensitivity, suggesting that a woman who looked unwell also possessed a more spiritual or artistic nature. The wasting away of flesh, the fragile curve of bones beneath skin, became part of the romantic ideal. This was not an image of survival, but of surrender, and yet it was praised as beautiful. It is almost absurd that the mark of high status was to look like you were slowly dying. To achieve this consumptive look, women practiced extreme methods. Eating became a controlled ritual, not for nourishment but for appearance. Small meals of vinegar-soaked vegetables, thin slices of fruit, or simply ice chips were common. Some women skipped meals entirely, convincing themselves that faintness added to their charm. Others forced themselves into tight corsets that not only reshaped their bodies, but also reduced their ability to eat comfortably. Hunger became a companion, and dizziness became part of their daily existence. If compared to modern times, it would be like applauding someone for starving themselves into exhaustion while calling it a fashion trend. The effects on their bodies were immediate. Skin lost its natural glow, lips dried and darkened, and muscles weakened. Dark circles bloomed under the eyes, which were not hidden but celebrated. Artists painted these shadows as if they were signs of depth and mystery. Magazines wrote admiringly about women with translucent skin, where veins could be faintly seen. This visibility of fragility was considered ethereal, as though the woman existed halfway between life and death. At gatherings, young girls were quietly praised when they looked faint or tired, as though they had achieved a difficult standard of elegance. The fascination with illness did not emerge by accident. Tuberculosis was rampant in the 19th century, and its symptoms were familiar to everyone. Yet instead of being seen only as tragic, the disease was romanticized. The thin figure, the flushed cheek from fever, the soft cough, all became woven into the image of tragic beauty. Playwrights and poets contributed to this myth, turning real suffering into an aesthetic. Young women, eager to be admired, copied what they saw, even if it meant damaging their health. What began as illness became performance, repeated daily until it became normal. This obsession also revealed the deep inequalities of the period. Working women who laboured in factories or in domestic service could not maintain such a look, as their bodies bore the marks of strength and exposure. The consumptive beauty standard belonged to the upper and middle classes, where women had the time and means to cultivate frailty. To look weak was a signal that one did not need to work. The more fragile a woman appeared, the more she demonstrated her separation from the world of labour. When I picture this, I feel uneasy about how suffering was elevated into a badge of honour. Behind the pale skin and hollowed faces lay countless private struggles. Some women collapsed from hunger, others endured headaches and fainting spells daily. Families often dismissed these symptoms as signs of delicate femininity, rather than as warnings of real harm. Doctors, too, sometimes reinforced the ideal by prescribing restrictive diets or tonics that weakened rather than healed. The cycle continued because no one questioned the connection between beauty and decay. The more a woman withered, the more society praised her. Inside parlours and drawing rooms, the atmosphere reflected this aesthetic. Curtains muted the sunlight, ensuring that faces looked even paler. Chairs were arranged so that women could sit still, their posture rigid, their movements minimal. Conversation often revolved around health, with subtle pride taken in complaints of weakness or sleeplessness. Perfume was dabbed lightly to mask any signs of poor hygiene, further preserving the illusion of frail refinement. Guests looked at one another not for vitality, but for signs of elegant decline. This beauty ideal also affected how women were remembered. Portraits hung in homes captured them at their weakest, emphasizing sunken cheeks and sombre gazes. To be immortalized in such a way was seen as proof of noble suffering. The paradox is clear: women were expected to live as symbols of near death, and then remembered as if they had always been on the edge of the grave. It was a life where every day carried the performance of dying slowly, yet gracefully. The consumptive look was more than fashion. It was a reflection of values that prize control, passivity, and silence. A healthy, active woman might speak, move, or act too freely, but a weak one was safely contained. Her body told the world she was delicate, dependent, and incapable of rebellion. Meals in Victorian society were not always about nourishment. For many women, they became displays of restraint, carefully measured moments where food was reduced to the bare minimum. The goal was not health or energy, but the achievement of thinness, a body that appeared fragile, and a face that showed the shadows of hunger. This was not because food was scarce, for plenty of households could afford bread, meat, and butter. It was because the cultural ideal demanded bodies that looked as though they had been worn down by illness or grief. Eating little was a way to prove discipline and refinement, and so women learned to deny themselves again and again. Diets took strange and dangerous forms. Vinegar was one of the most popular tricks, believed to reduce appetite and whiten the skin. Some women sipped it daily, grimacing at the taste but convinced that each swallow brought them closer to beauty. Others made meals of little more than raw lettuce leaves or slices of apple dipped in vinegar. Ice chips were also used to quiet the stomach, taken as though they were a substitute for food. Small rituals of deprivation were praised as marks of elegance, even when they left women faint and trembling. It is strangely ironic that meals meant to prove refinement often looked more like punishments than pleasures. These habits did not exist in secret. Families often witnessed daughters and wives refusing food at the table. Guests at gatherings noticed when young women picked at crumbs rather than enjoying what was served. Yet such behaviour was not always condemned. Instead, it could be quietly admired, a sign of restraint and dignity. To eat heartily was to risk seeming coarse, while to eat barely at all was to appear delicate. This turned hunger into performance, a daily demonstration of self-control. Medical understanding at the time did little to challenge these practices. Doctors sometimes even recommended reduced diets as remedies for women who complained of ailments. Thinness was associated with moral strength, while fullness of figure was often criticized as vulgar or unhealthy. Without clear scientific warnings, the cycle of restriction continued unchecked. Women measured their worth not by the health of their bodies, but by how little they seemed to need. The physical results were predictable. Weakness sets in quickly, leaving women prone to fainting and fatigue. Skin lost its colour, lips cracked, and hair became brittle. The lightness of body that was praised as elegance often came at the cost of energy, leaving many too frail to do more than sit quietly. Yet this frailty itself was celebrated, woven into the image of consumptive beauty. If compared to today, it would be like praising someone for surviving only on soda and crackers while calling them disciplined. Some women developed clear patterns of what we would now call eating disorders. The relentless pursuit of thinness led to cycles of starvation and illness. At the time, there was no language to describe these struggles, no recognition that they were symptoms of harm rather than virtues. Instead, women trapped in these habits were admired, and their suffering was overlooked. The cultural pressure to embody fragility left a little room for resistance. Social gatherings reinforced the ideal. Tables were spread with food, but women were expected to approach them with caution. A dainty bite, a small sip, or a refusal was more admired than genuine enjoyment. Men might feast, but women were meant to decline gracefully. Servants who prepared the meals often saw more food left untouched than eaten, scraps tossed away after being arranged for appearances. In such settings, hunger was invisible, masked by politeness and performance. For young girls entering society, the lesson was quickly learned. Mothers and older women guided them in the art of controlled eating, warning against the dangers of indulgence. To consume too much was to risk gossip, to risk being called unfeminine. These lessons shaped their lives, binding them to a pattern of deprivation that could last for years. Behind the lace and silk, behind the carefully arranged hair, were bodies weakened by constant denial. When I think about this, I feel unsettled by how willingly people embraced hunger as elegance. The reality of this beauty practice extended into homes across cities and towns. Kitchens might be full of food, but the women ate little of it. Children watched their mothers refuse meals, and sometimes imitated them. Men expected their wives to maintain fragile appearances, and so the cycle was reinforced. Hunger became a household companion, present at every table, tolerated and even encouraged. This way of living left marks not only on individual women but also on the society that praised them. By valuing fragility over vitality, Victorian culture taught generations that suffering could be beautiful. It created a cycle where appearance mattered more than health, and where denial was seen as a virtue. These ideas lingered, shaping standards that continued long after the century ended. Hunger became the quiet music of the dining room, unspoken but ever present. It whispered through empty plates, faint smiles, and trembling hands. The beauty it produced was admired, but the cost was hidden in weak bodies and silent struggles. They weakened themselves through hunger, turning daily meals into acts of suffering. This pursuit of fragility would not end at the dining table, as other substances soon became part of their routine. Among them was a liquid praised as medicine, yet carrying dangers more insidious than empty plates. Opium in the form of laudanum became a familiar presence in Victorian households, especially among women. Bottles of the dark liquid sat on shelves beside teas and tonics, purchased as easily as one might buy flour or bread. It was advertised as a cure for almost every discomfort, from sleepless nights to cramps, from nerves to sadness. Doctors prescribed it freely. Shopkeepers sold it without hesitation, and families accepted it as part of daily life. Women learned to reach for the bottle not with fear but with trust, convinced that a spoonful would bring calm and restore balance. In truth, it was not relief they were swallowing, but dependence that grew stronger with each dose. The preparation of laudanum was simple yet dangerous. It was opium dissolved in alcohol, a mixture that carried both the sedative effect of the drug and the intoxicating force of spirits. A few drops mixed into water or tea produced a sense of ease, dulling pain and softening worries. Larger doses could quiet a restless child or calm the cries of a newborn. It became so common that households often kept more than one bottle, and women took it regularly as if it were no more harmful than a vitamin. It is grimly amusing that what was treated as a harmless supplement was, in fact, liquid addiction poured into every glass. The effects shaped the rhythm of women's lives. A dose taken in the morning helped manage fatigue from sleepless nights. Another dose in the afternoon dulled the aches of tight corsets or the cramps of monthly pain. By evening, laudanum calmed frayed nerves after endless duties of caring for children, maintaining households, and meeting social expectations. The relief was real, but it came at a price unseen. Over time, tolerance built, requiring larger and larger amounts to feel the same comfort. Some women found themselves unable to sleep without it, unable to sit quietly without the familiar burn in the throat that signalled its presence. Children were not spared from its influence. Mothers added drops to bottles to quiet infants, a practice recommended in recipes printed in newspapers and pamphlets. Crying was considered a problem to be solved, and laudanum solved it swiftly. Babies lulled into unnatural stillness often paid with their health, and sometimes with their lives. Yet the practice persisted, because no one connected the tragedies with the remedy. In a world where infant death was already common, few questioned whether the cure itself was the cause. If compared to today, it would be like giving infants sleeping syrup made from pure narcotics bought over the counter. The presence of laudanum reached beyond bedrooms and nurseries. It was offered to guests who complained of headaches, shared among friends in quiet corners of parlours, and carried in small vials by women attending long church services. The bottle became a symbol of trust, of domestic care, of a solution always at hand. Doctors reinforced the habit by prescribing it for vague complaints such as hysteria or nerves, conditions they often used to describe women's unhappiness. The medical profession, instead of protecting women, encouraged their dependence, turning ordinary discomforts into lifelong addictions. The signs of reliance were visible, though not always recognized. Women drifted through their days with dull eyes and slower speech. Their energy faded, their appetite declined, and their emotions seemed muted. Yet these changes were interpreted as signs of refinement, as though the calmness produced by laudanum was a natural expression of femininity. Friends and family often accepted the state without question, mistaking sedation for composure. Behind the quiet exterior, however, many women were trapped in cycles of craving and withdrawal, their bodies weakened by the constant intake of opium and alcohol. When I imagine these scenes, I feel uneasy at how trust in medicine concealed a slow betrayal of the very people it claimed to help. The drug's reach was so extensive that even literature and art reflected it. Poets wrote of the haze of opium dreams, novelists described characters softened by drops of laudanum, and painters captured the languid postures of those under its influence. The substance was not hidden in shame, but woven into the culture as both a cure and an inspiration. The reality, however, was less romantic. In private, countless women battled with trembling hands and restless nights when their supply ran low. Withdrawals brought sweating, nausea, and despair, symptoms rarely spoken of because to admit them was to risk social embarrassment. The marketing of laudanum added to the illusion of safety. Bottles were sold with ornate labels, decorated with promises of purity and healing. Prices were low enough that even poor families could purchase them. The accessibility ensured that addiction spread across classes, though it was women who bore the heaviest burden. For them, laudanum was both an expectation and an escape, a way to endure the endless cycle of duties demanded by Victorian life. Over time, newspapers reported scandals of deaths linked to overdoses, and doctors occasionally warned of dangers. Yet the habit proved too ingrained to erase quickly. Regulation was weak, and sellers simply found new ways to promote the drug. Women continued to consume it, convinced that without it they could not cope with the demands placed upon them. The quiet destruction of health continued behind lace curtains and polished doors, invisible to those who preferred not to see. The story of laudanum use is not just about medicine, but about how society managed discomfort. Instead of addressing the causes of women's exhaustion or unhappiness, it offered them a bottle. Instead of questioning the roles that left them drained, it gave them a substance to numb the pain. In doing so, it preserved the order of the day, ensuring women remained calm, silent, and subdued. The cost was their health, their independence, and in many cases, their lives. They swallowed comfort disguised as a cure, dosing themselves each day with drops that turned into chains. What began as a household remedy became a hidden trap. How many more ways would their daily lives be shaped by substances that promised relief but delivered slow ruin? The daily routines of Victorian women left little room for rest. Their lives began at dawn and stretched long into the night, filled with demands that seemed endless. Mothers tended to their children's cries, often rising from bed several times before the sun even appeared. Wives served their husbands, preparing meals, sewing clothes, and keeping homes in order without pause. Servants and working women faced even harsher schedules, moving from one task to another until their bodies ached. Sleep was not considered a right or even a necessity, but a luxury reserved for those with power and wealth. For women, exhaustion became the quiet backdrop of their existence. The signs of this deprivation were most visible in their eyes. Eyelids drooped heavily, circles of darkness grew beneath them, and the natural brightness of expression faded away. Observers described women's gazes as empty, distant, or haunted, as though their souls had drifted elsewhere. These looks were not accidents of life, but consequences of relentless duties. Each sleepless night left its mark, hollowing faces and dulling the sparkle of individuality. The expression became so common that artists and writers began to portray it not as a burden, but as an ideal, celebrating the very exhaustion that consumed women daily. It is almost comical that society mistook the lifeless stare of fatigue for the charm of feminine mystery. Nighttime, instead of offering relief, often demanded even more labour. Infants needed constant care, their cries echoing through cramped rooms. Fires had to be maintained so that families would not wake in cold darkness. Laundry was boiled late into the night, and clothes mended by dim candlelight. The little rest the women could find was shallow and interrupted. Beds were shared with children or relatives, houses were noisy, and privacy was rare. A deep and restorative sleep was nearly impossible. In its place came broken moments of dozing, snatched between responsibilities, never enough to restore the body. The medical world of the time had few answers, Doctors frequently dismissed women's complaints of fatigue, labelling them as hysteria or weakness of constitution. Remedies often included laudanum or other sedatives, which dulled the mind but did not provide true rest. These solutions added to the problem, masking symptoms without addressing the cause. Women stumbled through days in fogs created by both exhaustion and narcotics, their clarity stolen twice over. Their bodies were not simply tired, they were trapped in cycles that allowed no recovery. If we compare this to the modern era, it would be like expecting someone to work 20 hours a day while praising their vacant stare as fashionable. This state of constant tiredness shaped culture in ways that are unsettling to consider. Paintings from the era often depicted women with dreamy, faraway eyes, as if lost in thought. In reality, those eyes were often heavy with fatigue, unfocused not from deep reflection but from lack of rest. Writers described heroines with languid expressions, admiring their passivity. What was celebrated as beauty was in truth the visible mark of overwork. Exhaustion became aesthetic, turned into a quality of elegance rather than a cry for relief. Daily household structures reinforced the cycle. Meals had to be cooked from scratch, fires constantly tended, and water hauled from pumps or wells. Every task required physical effort, and none could be postponed. For mothers of multiple children, nights blurred into days, and days blurred into nights, each one demanding more than the last. The idea of resting was considered indulgent, a waste of time that could be spent in service to others. Women learned to ignore their body's signals, to accept headaches, dizziness, and blurred vision as normal parts of life. The toll extended beyond the physical. Mental weariness grew alongside bodily fatigue. Without sleep, emotions became unstable and thoughts slowed. Women often described feelings of being detached, of moving through life as if in a dream. This detachment was praised as grace, when in fact it was a symptom of deep exhaustion. Children grew accustomed to mothers whose eyes no longer shone with energy, but stared blankly even in moments of supposed joy. Husbands saw wives who seemed subdued, mistaking weariness for compliance. I find it deeply unsettling to imagine entire households where women lived in this haze, their identities blurred by fatigue that never ended. The environment itself worsened the problem. Industrial cities were loud, filled with the constant clatter of carts, machines, and street vendors. Smoke from factories seeped into homes, making breathing difficult. Nights were not quiet retreats but extensions of the day's chaos. Even in wealthier neighbourhoods, servants moved through halls and kitchens late into the night, ensuring the comfort of others while sacrificing their own. Sleep was interrupted by noise, by light, by demands, and by the ever-present worry of what the next day would bring. For those who tried to resist, there was little support. A woman who sought more rest might be accused of laziness or selfishness. Neighbours gossiped about wives who did not meet every expectation, and families pressured women to keep pace. Society left no space for honesty about exhaustion. Instead, it rewarded silence and performance. Women who endured without complaint were admired, while those who faltered were shamed. Over time, the silence became habitual, and exhaustion was woven into the very definition of femininity. The eyes of these women told a story, even when their voices did not. Their vacant stares, their heavy lids, and their distant expressions became symbols of the age. They were portraits of a life without rest, presented as if they were desirable. In truth, they revealed the cost of endless work and relentless duty. The image of the weary woman, painted and praised, was nothing more than the mask of exhaustion, worn by generations who had no other choice. They carried the marks of sleepless nights in their eyes, and society applauded it as elegance. The demands of daily life drained them until they seemed like shadows of themselves. What further sacrifices would be demanded when even rest was denied to them? Corsets were considered indispensable in Victorian wardrobes, tightly laced garments that promised to mould the body into the fashionable hourglass figure. To wear one was not a matter of choice but of social expectation, and so women of nearly every class endured them daily. The fabric was stiff, reinforced with whalebone or metal, and tightened until breathing became shallow. This was not about comfort, but about presentation, and the cost to health was immense. Women walked through the streets and parlours not with ease but with the stiffness of bodies held captive by their own clothing. The immediate effect of the corset was restriction. Internal organs were compressed, lungs struggled to expand, and stomachs were forced into unnatural positions. Breathing deeply was almost impossible, leaving women lightheaded and faint. Their skin often took on a pale, bluish tinge, a sign that oxygen was scarce. What appeared from a distance as grace was, in truth, a body starved of air. It is bitterly ironic that the ideal of poise was achieved through the slow suffocation of those expected to embody it. Walking became a challenge under such strain. Steps were shortened, movement slowed, and balance was unsteady. Women swayed or leaned slightly, not from elegance but from the discomfort of their constricted bodies. Standing for long periods risked fainting, and collapses in public were not uncommon. These episodes were excused as delicate weakness, but they were the natural result of garments designed to prevent proper breathing. Onlookers admired the supposed fragility, mistaking suffering for refinement. The long-term consequences were severe. Constant compression led to chronic back pain, misaligned spines, and weakened muscles. Women found themselves unable to sit comfortably without support, their posture permanently altered. Some developed digestive troubles as stomachs were displaced and intestines pressed unnaturally. Doctors occasionally warned against the dangers, but fashion outweighed medical advice. The corset remained a daily requirement, and women bore its effects silently, often for decades. If we compare this to the present, it would be like strapping the body into a vice each morning and praising the discomfort as beauty. The act of dressing became a ritual of submission. Maids or family members helped tighten the laces, pulling harder and harder until the desired shape was achieved. Women learned to hold their breath while being bound, bracing against the pressure until the garment was finally secured. Relief was temporary, lasting only until movement reminded them of the restraint. Sitting, walking, or bending brought constant awareness of the tight embrace. Each gesture was modified, each breath measured. Their bodies no longer belonged to themselves but to the dictates of fashion. Fainting couches, common in Victorian homes, reflected this reality. These pieces of furniture were not simply decorative but practical, offering women places to collapse when the corset proved too much. Guests in drawing rooms often witnessed such episodes, yet instead of questioning the cause, society normalized the sight. A fainting woman was viewed as delicate and graceful, embodying ideals of femininity. The fact that her collapse came from lack of oxygen was ignored. When I picture this, I cannot help but feel disturbed that furniture was designed to accommodate clothing that slowly crushes the body. Corsets also influenced how women carried themselves emotionally. The constant discomfort left little space for relaxation or spontaneity. Smiles were restrained, laughter subdued, and movements carefully measured to avoid drawing attention to pain. The garments created not only physical but also social control, ensuring that women moved slowly, spoke softly, and appeared subdued. It was a visible and daily reminder of limitations imposed upon them. The culture of corsetry spread far beyond fashion magazines. Mothers taught daughters how to endure the lacing process, passing down both the skill and the expectation. Girls were introduced to corsets at a young age, their bodies shaped long before they reached maturity. By the time they became women, their ribs and spines often showed permanent changes. To resist was nearly impossible, as society judged harshly those who chose looser garments. A woman without a corset was labelled careless or indecent, no matter how uncomfortable the alternative proved to be. Art reinforced the image. Paintings and photographs celebrated the narrow waists and upright postures achieved by corsetry. Writers described heroines with impossibly small figures, using words like graceful and elegant while ignoring the suffering behind the image. Women themselves learned to speak proudly of their small waists, repeating the language of beauty while hiding their discomfort. The standard became so deeply ingrained that even those who suffered most accepted it as normal. For wealthier women, corsets were part of elaborate outfits layered with heavy skirts and petticoats, making the burden even greater. Servants and working women sometimes wore less restrictive versions, yet they too felt pressure to conform. The garment crossed class lines, symbolizing both status and control. Whether in palaces or cramped houses, women moved under the same restraint, united by the silent pain stitched into their clothing. The long hours of wearing corsets shaped not only bodies but also identities. Women learned to endure discomfort quietly, to accept faintness as part of daily life, and to treat restriction as natural. Their health eroded slowly, hidden beneath the illusion of elegance. The mark of refinement was not vitality, but the ability to appear calm while suffocating. The corset turned women into living displays, admired for their shapes but denied the freedom to move or breathe fully. They staggered through life, their bodies moulded by fabric and bone, their breath shallow and their steps uncertain. The beauty standard demanded restraint so extreme it bordered on cruelty. What other poisons would fashion impose when even the act of breathing freely was considered excessive? Hair was another battlefield in the struggle to meet Victorian standards of beauty. Women desired rich, dark colours or shining golden tones, yet the dyes available to them were often mixtures of heavy metals and corrosive chemicals. Lead, mercury, and other toxic substances were stirred into liquids and pastes, then applied directly to the scalp. The effect was immediate and dramatic, transforming hair into striking shades. But beneath the surface, the skin burned, blistered, and peeled away. The cost of beauty was measured in strands that fell from the head, leaving bald patches where hair once grew thick. The process of dyeing was both messy and painful. Women sat still while mixtures were brushed onto their heads, the fumes sharp and suffocating. The chemicals clung to the skin, causing irritation that worsened with each treatment. Some endured scabs and sores, while others felt their hair loosen at the roots until handfuls came away. Yet society praised the results, ignoring the suffering behind them. Smooth, evenly coloured hair was admired, while thinning or fading hair was seen as careless. It is grimly laughable that women were expected to poison their scalps just to avoid the insult of looking ordinary. When hair fell away in clumps, wigs became the solution. These wigs were not crafted from synthetic fibres as they are today, but from human hair gathered from the dead or sold by the desperate poor. Markets traded in the hair of corpses, cut and bundled before burial. The wealthy purchased wigs fashioned from these locks, placing them proudly on their heads as though death itself could be transformed into elegance. Wearing another person's hair was not considered shameful but fashionable, a strange intimacy with strangers long gone. The wigs were heavy, stiff, and often unclean. Sweat collected beneath them, and lice thrived in the hidden layers. To wear one required constant adjustment and discomfort, yet they were part of the uniform of status. Women arranged them with pins and combs, adorning them with ribbons or jewels, creating illusions of fullness and vitality. In reality, the natural hair beneath often withered, choked by lack of air and worsened by repeated exposure to toxic dyes. Bald patches grew wider, and dependence on wigs became permanent. If compared to modern life, it would be like covering chemical burns with a designer wig bought from a hospital ward. The use of wigs extended into homes and social gatherings. Women wore them during dinners, dances, and even in private family moments, unwilling to reveal the state of their natural hair. At night, the wigs were usually removed, but some women kept them on while resting to preserve appearances. This choice carried risks. rodents, attracted to the smell of oils and sweat, sometimes gnawed at the wigs as their wearers slept. There are accounts of women waking with painful bites, their scalps damaged not just by poison but by vermin. I find it unsettling to imagine how far people went in silence, enduring both burns and infestations in the name of beauty. The culture surrounding hair was not simply about appearance but about identity. A full head of hair symbolized youth, fertility, and femininity. To lose it was to risk ridicule, to lose status in both private and public spheres. Women clung to wigs and dyes because without them they faced social judgment. Men, too, expected their wives and daughters to maintain certain standards, reinforcing the cycle. The damage caused by chemicals was ignored, while the shame of baldness was exaggerated. Markets for hair and wigs thrived across Victorian cities. Barbers, undertakers, and traders supplied the raw material. The poor, in desperation, sold their hair for coins, their poverty worn on the heads of the wealthy. Dead women's locks, cut before burial, travelled to workshops where they were cleaned and sewn into wigs. These trades were hidden from polite conversation, yet everyone knew the origins. Death and poverty fed fashion, and fashion disguised itself as refinement. The rituals of hair care grew stranger as damage worsened. Women smeared oils, powders, and perfumes onto their scalps to soothe burning skin or to mask the odour of wigs. They tried ointments advertised in papers, many of which only added more chemicals to already inflamed flesh. Few questioned the harm because the pressure to conform was stronger than the instinct to protect health. Suffering became private, while the illusion of shining hair remained public. This obsession also revealed the contradictions of Victorian ideals. Society demanded purity, modesty, and restraint. Yet it pushed women to drape themselves in the hair of strangers and endure poisons. The very symbols of refinement were built on practices that decayed bodies and spread disease. Beauty, once again, was drawn not from vitality but from artifice and harm. The result was a generation of women whose hairlines receded, whose scalps bore scars, and whose health declined quietly behind the curtain of social approval. The sight of wigs adorned with jewels in candlelit rooms told one story. The hidden sores and broken strands beneath told another. Women carried both, presenting elegance to the world while bearing the cost in silence. Their hair, once a natural crown, became a battlefield of fashion, industry, and survival. They scorched their scalps with poison and covered the wounds with hair stolen from the poor and the dead. What was presented as elegance was in truth a disguise for loss. And how much deeper could vanity cut when even vermin were drawn to feast upon these illusions of beauty? Arsenic was not hidden in the shadows of Victorian life. It was openly sold, recommended, and consumed, often disguised in forms that looked harmless. Among these, arsenic candy stood out as both a curiosity and a danger. Market stalls displayed white lozenges and pastel sweets, promising beauty and health in every bite. Women believed these candies could clear the complexion, brighten the skin, and even purify the blood. They were consumed not as medicine but as part of routine, passed around like any other treat. Yet behind the sweetness was a poison that slowly dismantled bodies, starting with the mouth itself. The habit began innocently enough. Arsenic candies were cheap, sold in paper cones or small boxes, and widely available. Vendors promoted them as marvels of science, insisting that they carried benefits far beyond taste. Women and even young girls chewed them daily, expecting transformation. The idea that beauty could come from within took on literal meaning, though the substance they swallowed was corrosive. The reality was that each piece chipped away at health, and the first signs appeared in the teeth. It is disturbingly ironic that people smiled after eating sweets that were steadily destroying their ability to smile at all. Mouths told the story long before the rest of the body showed decline. Teeth loosened at the roots, Gums became inflamed, and breath carried a foul odour impossible to mask. The metallic taste of arsenic lingered, a constant reminder of what had been consumed. Yet women ignored these warnings, convinced that the pallor of their skin mattered more than the state of their mouths. In drawing rooms and parlours, they concealed their smiles, keeping their lips closed while admiring the glow of their complexions in mirrors. Beauty had been redefined so narrowly that visible illness was overlooked, even when it was literally rotting away inside the body. Dentists and doctors occasionally raised alarms. They noticed patterns of decay, of women arriving with teeth crumbling despite their age. In some cases, entire rows of teeth loosened, leaving mouths unable to chew properly. But warnings were muffled by the persistence of fashion. Medical authority was weaker than the cultural obsession with the whiteness of skin, and arsenic continued to be consumed in alarming quantities. If we compare this to modern times, it would be like people willingly chewing tablets made of bleach because they believed it would give them clearer skin. The effects went beyond the mouth. Arsenic travelled through the body, weakening organs and poisoning the blood. Stomachs cramped, skin dried, and fatigue set in. Yet these signs were dismissed as minor ailments, part of the natural fragility expected of women. In truth, the sweets that promised purity carried slow death, spooned into mouths daily with no recognition of the cost. Children also joined in the habit, given candies by parents who thought they were offering care. The innocence of the gesture made the danger even more cruel. Within households, jars of arsenic sweets sat alongside bread, tea, and sugar. Guests were offered them as tokens of hospitality, unaware or unwilling to consider the harm. Women took pride in keeping supplies on hand, as if they were markers of refinement. Families bonded over what they thought were small indulgences, never realizing they were sharing poison. Even when the consequences became clear, denial proved easier than change. To abandon the habit was to risk blemishes, to risk looking less refined. Vanity held more weight than warnings. The paradox grew sharper as decay advanced. Women sought more candy to preserve their skin, even as their mouths collapsed. Some wore veils or avoided smiling, hiding the damage behind layers of fashion. Others endured dental pain quietly, treating it as another burden of femininity. Complaints were muted by shame, because to admit suffering was to admit vanity gone too far. Silence allowed the practice to continue, passing through generations like a dark inheritance. I cannot help but feel unsettled at how easily appearance outweighs health in choices repeated day after day. The markets that sold arsenic candies thrived on this silence. Sellers shouted their wares proudly, competing with other vendors of dyes, powders, and tonics. They promised beauty, energy, and longevity, offering death wrapped in paper as if it were a gift. Regulation was weak, and few authorities intervened. Profit outweighed protection, and the poor, as always, were the easiest victims. For them, arsenic sweets were affordable luxuries, more accessible than safer foods. They bought them because they could, not because they understood the risk. The cultural acceptance of arsenic candies fit into a broader pattern of Victorian life. Poison was everywhere on faces in the form of lead powders, in hair from dyes, in the very clothing dyed with lethal pigments. Candy simply provided another route of exposure, disguised as pleasure rather than fashion. The mouth became the stage on which this contradiction played out most visibly. While women smiled faintly in portraits, their real teeth often cracked, loosened, or disappeared entirely. Elegance was painted over decay, and no one dared to break the illusion. The story of arsenic candies reveals the lengths to which people went for beauty in that age. It was not ignorance alone, but a deep willingness to accept harm if it promised status. Each sweet eaten reinforced the hierarchy that praised pale, smooth skin over vitality. Each sweet carried the taste of poison masked by sugar, shaping lives through tiny, daily choices. The tragedy lay not only in the suffering it caused, but in the acceptance of that suffering as normal. They chewed poison in the name of beauty, trading fresh breath and strong teeth for pale faces admired in parlours. What began as a small indulgence ended in decay that could not be hidden. How much deeper could vanity cut when even a smile became too costly to reveal? Dresses in Victorian society were more than clothing. They were symbols of wealth, status, and refinement, designed to dazzle in parlours, at theatres, and during promenades in the park. Among the most prized garments were gowns dyed in brilliant shades of green and deep violet. These colours were vivid in ways that natural dyes could not achieve, glowing under gaslight and drawing admiration from onlookers. What few understood at first was that these shades were created using arsenic, the same poison already found in powders, candies, and medicines. The beauty of the fabric came at a hidden cost, for each fold of cloth carried dust that could sicken or kill. The process of dyeing cloth with arsenic was celebrated as progress. Chemists had discovered how to produce colours so bold they seemed almost unnatural. Emerald green, in particular, became a sensation, draped across the shoulders of fashionable women and spread out in wide skirts that filled entire rooms. Purple shades, too, carried similar risks but equal popularity. Women competed for the most striking hues, convinced that the brilliance of colour equated to refinement. The gowns were displayed proudly, even though each thread was laced with poison. It is bitterly ironic that the more beautiful the dress, the more dangerous it became to the one who wore it. The danger lay in the fine particles that flaked off the fabric as women moved, brushed past furniture, or adjusted their skirts. Tiny bits of arsenic dust filled the air. Inhaling these particles irritated lungs and throats, while skin that touched the fabric broke out in rashes and sores. The women themselves sometimes grew ill, but the worst effects often fell upon their servants. Maids who handled the dresses, brushed them clean, or laundered them, soaked in tubs of arsenic-tainted water, absorbing poison through their skin. Some collapsed after long hours of work, their health destroyed by clothing meant only for display. Despite growing reports of illness, the dresses remained in demand. Society praised women who appeared in shimmering green, calling them elegant and fashionable. Artists painted them, authors described them, and magazines encouraged more women to follow the trend. The connection between beauty and danger was acknowledged by a few but dismissed by many. Wealthy women, in particular, valued the attention their gowns received, and so they ignored the risks. Servants, who bore the brunt of the suffering, had no voice to protest. They continued to wash and press fabrics that ate away at their skin, unseen casualties of fashion. The effects on wearers could not always be hidden. Women developed sores where the dresses rubbed against their arms or waists. Their hands burned after adjusting skirts, and their complexions paled even further as poison seeped into their systems. Some fainted at gatherings, their weakness attributed to delicate constitutions rather than toxic clothing. Guests admired the gowns without realizing the price being paid in real time. The admiration for colour blinded society to the damage caused by the chemicals that created it. If compared to today, it would be like celebrating jackets coated in pesticides while pretending the rashes they caused were signs of refinement. The laundering of these gowns was especially deadly. Water mixed with dye released high concentrations of arsenic into tubs, where maids bent over for hours, scrubbing and wringing. Their hands cracked and bled, their nails loosened, and their skin erupted with painful blisters. Inhaling the fumes left them coughing violently, sometimes too weak to continue working. Deaths among laundresses were whispered about, yet rarely connected openly to the gowns. For wealthier households, the suffering of servants remained invisible, overshadowed by the glitter of parties and promenades. Newspapers occasionally reported scandals about poisoned dresses, warning of the risks. Doctors presented cases of unexplained illness among both wearers and workers. Still, change came slowly. Some women insisted they could not give up the fashionable hues, claiming that the warnings were exaggerated. Others simply had no knowledge of the connection, as manufacturers denied any responsibility. The industry that profited from selling brilliant fabrics had little incentive to admit the truth. In a society where appearance mattered more than safety, denial prevailed. I find it deeply unsettling to imagine women spinning through ballrooms in gowns that quietly killed the very people who cared for them. These dresses also became a kind of morbid spectacle. Guests sometimes remarked on the sickly look of women wearing the brightest greens, noting their pale skin and weary eyes. Yet instead of linking these signs to poison, people described them as elegant. The image of fragility, once again, was turned into beauty, even when it was clearly a symptom of harm. The gowns became part of a broader culture that valued suffering as aesthetic, a continuation of the same ideals that praised starvation and exhaustion. The tragedy of arsenic-dyed dresses lies not only in their toxicity but in their acceptance. Women embraced them willingly, even proudly, because they represented status. To wear vivid green was to signal wealth, to stand apart from the poor who could only afford dull colours. The irony was that the dresses harmed not only those who wore them, but especially those least able to resist the servants who washed them, the children who touched them, the workers who made them. Poison trickled downward, with the weakest paying the heaviest price. In private, some women confessed fears about their gowns, but few gave them up. Parties demanded appearances, and appearances demanded sacrifice. The toxic fabrics became one more silent burden, woven into the fabric of daily life. They glowed under lights, dazzled admirers, and left invisible scars. They dressed themselves in colours that gleamed with death, every stitch carrying dust that lingered in the air and soaked into the skin. What looked like elegance in candlelight was, in truth, a haze of poison surrounding each step. How far could fashion go in demanding sacrifice when even the very fabric of a dress carried the power to kill? Bathing was not a daily habit in Victorian society, at least not among the upper classes who prided themselves on restraint. For many women of wealth and status, immersion in water was treated with suspicion. They believed that bathing too often would weaken the body, drain its vitality, and even threaten their virtue. Some thought frequent washing might strip away strength or endanger chastity, a reflection of fears that connected the body's cleanliness with morality. As a result, weeks often passed without a proper bath. Instead, they relied on light sponging or wiping, leaving layers of powder, sweat, and dust to build up on their skin. The visible result was a strange contradiction. Outwardly, women appeared polished, their faces powdered with white lead, and their bodies wrapped in fine fabrics. Yet beneath the surface, skin was coated with grime, pores clogged, and odours concealed only by perfumes. These perfumes were often heavy and animal-based, designed to overpower natural smells rather than eliminate them. Garments carried the same burden, absorbing sweat and oils, rarely washed because laundering such fabrics risked damage. The illusion of refinement was maintained in drawing rooms and parlours, while the body beneath quietly deteriorated. It is grimly amusing that women who claimed to embody purity were, in truth, layered in filth, hidden under powders and lace. The fear of bathing was reinforced by the medical voices of the time. Some doctors warned that soaking in hot water could weaken the nerves or invite illness. Others suggested that frequent bathing might upset the body's natural balance. Without widespread plumbing, bathing also required effort. Water had to be hauled, heated, and poured into tubs. For servants, the labour was exhausting, and for mistresses, the process seemed excessive. A quick wipe with a damp cloth, often scented with vinegar or rose water, was considered sufficient. This routine was repeated for weeks, until dirt and powder formed a second skin. The consequences went far beyond appearance. Skin infections, rashes, and sores became common. The constant application of lead-based cosmetics added further layers of poison. Sweat mixed with powders and dust, forming crusts that cracked and bled. Women complained of itching and irritation, but rarely admitted that it came from neglecting to wash. To bathe more frequently was to risk gossip, as if too much attention to cleanliness suggested something improper. The paradox left them trapped between discomfort and the demands of reputation. If compared to modern habits, it would be like changing clothes daily while never washing the body underneath, then masking the smell with strong colognes. Servants, once again, bore part of the burden. They scrubbed undergarments and linens, often dealing with the residue of powders, sweat, and oils that stained the fabric. Without modern detergents, washing was limited in effectiveness, and odours persisted. Bedding absorbed the same mixture, trapping women in their own waste each night. Curtains and upholstery clung to the smells, which perfumes attempted to disguise but never fully removed. Entire households carried the scent of stagnation, normalized by familiarity. The rare occasions when full baths were taken were almost ceremonial. Large tubs were filled with heated water, often in bedrooms rather than bathrooms, as plumbing was scarce. Women were assisted by maids, who poured water, scrubbed the skin lightly, and dried their mistresses with heavy towels. These baths were scheduled events, not spontaneous moments of refreshment. They might take place once every few weeks, marking a reset after long periods of neglect. The shock of immersion was considered dangerous, so baths were brief, cautious, and carefully controlled. Cultural expectations reinforced the practice. Writers praised women who appeared delicate and reserved, not those who pursued physical activity that would require regular washing. The pale, powdered face became a symbol of refinement, while sun-kissed, freshly bathed skin suggested labour and vulgarity. To appear too clean was to risk looking too physical, too alive, which clashed with the ideal of fragile femininity. Cleanliness was paradoxically associated with the working classes, whose labour forced them to wash more often, while the wealthy embraced filth under layers of cosmetics and perfume. I find it unsettling to imagine drawing rooms filled with women who looked elegant in gowns, but carried the unmistakable scent of decay beneath. The health consequences were not always visible immediately, which made denial easy. Women endured constant fatigue, headaches, and illnesses, yet these were explained as natural to their sex. In truth, many of the ailments came from bodies struggling under layers of dirt and poison. Their skin, starved of air and clogged with powders, could not function properly. The immune system was weakened, infections spread, and yet the culture insisted that restraint was preferable to washing. Even within families, the practice shaped daily life. Husbands accepted the routines, accustomed to the perfumes and powders that disguised their wives' neglect. Children often learned the same habits, raised to believe that bathing was suspicious rather than healthy. Generations passed down the fear of water, embedding it into the culture of refinement. What might have been dismissed as ignorance persisted because it was framed as virtue. The contradiction remains striking in hindsight. A society that claimed moral superiority tolerated bodies that slowly decomposed beneath fine clothing. Appearances mattered more than truth, and the illusion of elegance outweighed the reality of filth. Women paid the price in discomfort, illness, and shortened lives. While their suffering was hidden behind silks and powders, they carried layers of sweat, powder, and dust as if they were garments of status, mistaking decay for refinement. What looked like elegance in parlours was, in truth, the slow rot of bodies denied the simplest act of cleansing. How much further could denial go when even water itself was treated as an enemy of beauty? Perfume in Victorian society was not merely a luxury but a necessity, especially for women whose bathing habits were rare and restrained. The scents that drifted through drawing rooms and ballrooms did not come from flowers alone. They were crafted from animal secretions, substances collected from deer, whales, and even beavers. Musk was obtained from the glands of deer, while castoreum came from sacs located near the anal glands of beavers. Ambergris, a prized fixative, was collected from the digestive systems of whales. These raw materials were processed into perfumes that promised elegance, masking the odours of bodies that went unwashed for weeks. The irony of using animal decay to create an illusion of refinement was rarely discussed, yet it defined the olfactory landscape of the era. Women applied perfume generously, dabbing it onto necks, chests, and wrists. The strong scents were meant to overpower the reality of sweat trapped beneath layers of clothing and cosmetics. Garments of silk and wool absorbed the oils, releasing fragrance slowly throughout the day. In crowded rooms filled with bodies and candle smoke, perfumes mingled with the air, competing to disguise the staleness of unwashed skin. The result was overwhelming but considered essential. Without these animal-based perfumes, the truth of daily neglect would have been impossible to hide. It is almost darkly humorous that the very people who prided themselves on refinement carried the stench of beasts disguised as sophistication.